Well, we're together again to continue the journey of what I learned without being taught in the Indian community. And I want to emphasize again that the Indians are short on teaching. They never sat me down to teach me anything. But by living with them and listening to their stories, that's how I learned some things that have been very helpful to me in my journey of faith. And in my very first meeting with the Indian leadership, I asked the question, okay, help me out. How do you prefer to be addressed? And the immediate and unequivocal answer was Indians. For they said, quote, our identity is with the indigenous Indians of Mother Earth throughout the globe. You see, other terms were labels assigned to them. Uh, for example, Native Americans. You see, their identity as Indians historically precedes 1492, the quote, discovery of America. You see, prior to 1492, the Indians existed. America did not. So for them to be labeled Native Americans doesn't make any sense to them because their stories, their history preceded America. Now, this conversation was a prelude, the beginning of a journey of clarification for me. From that conversation, I discovered the distinction between labels and identity. The majority could label them as Native Americans, but their identity was Indian. Now, one of the labels imposed by the new European authority in the land of the Indians was that there were civilized and uncivilized tribes. Now, I've spent a lot of time with the majority community contesting this label. Because this label was that the civilized tribes were the settled tribes. The tribes that were sort of like the Anglos, uh, settling in communities. They lived on reservations, of course, granted to them by the majority group, so they would have a place, be settled, and they were civilized. And therefore, nomadic tribes that roamed the prairies were not civilized. Now, this labeling is really ridiculous and required me to redefine civilization in relationship to the Indian community. Now, my experience with the tribes in Africa was helpful for me, for as I visited and became acquainted with the African tribal cultures who were labeled uncivilized by the Western world, and they were uncivilized because the Western world defined civilization according to the extent of the Enlightenment, the extent that the industrial and technological revolutions had been integrated into culture. Those were the most civilized. My experience in Africa was that these revolutions had nothing to do with how civil people were to each other. I had an increasing sense that the most civil cultures were those that really cared for, and honored the life of another. And to be specific, the most civilized were those who placed a priority on how they cared for their elderly and their children. This understanding was set in concrete for me in my journey with the faith community within the Indian community. This is what I experienced as I watched the Indian way of caring for their elderly and caring for their children. There was never an event in my 8 years with the Indian community when children were excluded. They were always welcome and an essential part of Indian life. Annual conference included children. An administrative body of the church, children were welcome. Meeting of pastors often included children, for the cost of child care is not on the radar of possibility for the permanently poor. When food was served, always the elderly were the first served. Often careers were abandoned as men and women paused to provide care for the elderly and their family. And you think, sure, for mother and father, but it went beyond that. It might have been for an uncle or an aunt, or maybe an elderly person who had no family. An everyday illustration of the prominence of the sensitivity to care and for and realize the importance of the elderly and children in our midst. I was a walker for exercise, and in the Indian community, the pace of the walk was determined by the slowest pace of any person in the group. Most common was the shuttled step of an elder or the short step pace of a small child. We walked the pace of the slowest person in the group, most often an elder or a child. Now, I was a part of other groups who walked together regularly, not in the Indian community. But in those groups, the pace was always set by the one who walked the faster pace, as others of us just gladly lagged behind. What a difference in everyday life. In everyday life, if a children or an elderly was with you, you walked at their pace, not at your pace. I learned without being taught how a group treated, included, and served the elderly and children of their community. This is what determined the extent of whether or not they were civilized. The determining factor had nothing to do with whether or not they were settled on a reservation or nomadic on the prairie. Both were highly civilized because both placed a priority in community life on involving welcoming, and being governed by the needs of children and the elderly. You see, being civil is wishing for and acting for the very best for the other person. This is what the life and teachings of Jesus were all about. This is the reason why Alexander Colby, in his great book about Jesus, referred to Jesus as the man for others. That's what it means to be civil, being for the other. In our culture, narcissism, acting and behaving for the sake of oneself, is the guiding principle for many. Oh, to be sure we're enlightened. Oh, to be sure we have been industrialized. We are technologically astute. However, what I learned from the Indian community is that civility is best defined of how we relate to the other. I cherish my experience of civility in all of the tribes and profoundly disagree of the labels cast upon them by others, that some were civilized and some were uncivilized. What I learned was to be civil, honoring, respecting, and responding to the needs of others prevailed in the Indian community in a way that profoundly affected my life. I hope this learning has been of interest to you and for you to think about it and converse about it. Here are some questions. What are your stories of labels misrepresenting the true identity of individuals or groups? What is your response to the understanding that being civilized is determined by how persons treat others rather than being enlightened or having experienced the industrial or technological revolutions? Finally, what is your assessment of whether the care of children and elderly are the priorities of the culture of the United States today? Enjoy your journey as I have.